If you are a lover of stories that stays with you even after watching, subscribe so YouTube doesn't hide the next story from you. Let's dive in. The oppressive humidity of the city night clung to my skin like a second shadow as I slipped through the service entrance of the Gilded Perch. My lungs burned from the 4 flights of stairs I'd sprinted up because the freight elevator was broken again. I checked my reflection in the polished chrome of a prep table, frantically smoothing the flyaway strands of my bangs and tightening the elastic of my ponytail. I had been in this city for 90 days, and for 90 days, I had played the part of the perfect, unremarkable ghost. "Lily, get your tray and get to the lounge now," Elias snapped. The floor manager was usually a man of calm precision, but tonight he was vibrating with a nervous energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. His bow tie was crooked, and a bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the industrial air conditioning. "I'm on it," I replied, reaching for my black apron. "What's the rush? It's a Tuesday." "It's a massacre if you move too slow," Elias whispered, leaning in so close I could smell the stale espresso on his breath. "Table 1 is occupied. The entire terrace has been cleared. Madden Taylor is here, Lily." The name hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. My hands froze on the knot of my apron. Madden Taylor didn't just own the syndicate that ran the docks and the high-rises. He owned the very air people breathed in this neighborhood. He was a ghost story told to keep rivals in line. A man whose reputation for cold, calculated violence was only matched by his immense, untouchable wealth. "Why me?" I managed to ask, my voice sounding small even to my own ears. "That's Sarah's section. She's been here for years." "Sarah is in the bathroom having a panic attack," Elias hissed, his fingers digging into my shoulder with a desperate grip. "Listen to me. You are the only one left who doesn't shake when you pour wine. Go out there, be professional, and for the love of everything holy, be invisible. Do not look him in the eye. Do not speak unless spoken to. Just be background noise. Invisible. That was my specialty. I had spent a decade perfecting the art of being a shadow. I had fled the ruins of my family name with nothing but the clothes on my back, and a secret etched into my skin that I planned to take to my grave. In a city of millions, I was nobody. I was a waitress in a black shirt, a girl with a neutral face and a quiet step. I took a shaky breath, smoothing down my black skirt and checking that my collar was turned up high against my neck. The secret was safe. The fabric was thick. As long as I stayed in the periphery, I would survive the night. I pushed through the heavy velvet curtains that separated the chaotic kitchen from the hushed luxury of the rooftop lounge. The transition was jarring. Outside, the city hummed with noise and grit, but in here the world was bathed in amber light and the scent of expensive bourbon. The crystal glasses on the tables caught the glow of the low-hanging chandeliers, and the dark wood floors gleamed with a predatory polish. I moved toward the terrace, my spine straight and my chin held at just the right angle to look attentive but humble. The air grew colder as I approached the open glass doors. There, silhouetted against the glittering skyline of the city, sat the man who held everyone's life in his hands. Madden Taylor was younger than the rumors suggested, but his presence was twice as heavy. He sat with a casual, terrifying grace, his black suit tailored so sharply it looked like armor. His dark hair was slicked back, revealing a jawline that looked like it had been carved from granite. But it was his hands that caught my eye as I stepped closer to set down the bottle of vintage red he had ordered. His hands were covered in intricate ink, dark patterns that climbed up his wrists and disappeared under his white cuffs. On the back of his right hand, a lion's head stared back at me, its eyes fierce and demanding. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I kept my gaze fixed on the label of the wine bottle, my fingers steady as I began the pour. I was doing it. I was being the shadow Elias needed. I was the invisible girl. Then a sudden sharp movement from one of the men standing behind Madden caught me off guard. A heavy foot shifted, catching the edge of my shoe. The world seemed to slow down. The bottle tipped an inch too far. A single dark red splash of wine leaped from the glass, landing squarely on the pristine white cuff of Madden Taylor's shirt. The silence that followed was deafening. The two men standing guard behind him moved instantly, their hands reaching inside their jackets. The younger waiter near the bar turned away, his face pale with second-hand terror. Madden didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply looked down at the crimson stain on his wrist as if it were a bug he intended to crush. "I'm so sorry, sir," I whispered, reaching instinctively for the linen napkin tucked into my belt. "Let me clean that." Madden finally looked up. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, cold and devoid of any warmth. He didn't look at the napkin. He looked at me as if I were a smudge on a window pane. "Remove her," he said. His voice was a low, smooth drawl that carried the weight of a death sentence. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't have to. The bearded man standing directly behind me lunged forward, his massive hand clamping onto my upper arm with bruising force. "Wait, please, it was an accident," I gasped, struggling as he began to drag me toward the shadowed corner of the terrace, away from the light, away from the witnesses. In the scuffle, the guard's rough fingers snagged the edge of my stiff collar. I felt the fabric give way with a sickening tear. I stumbled, my head snapping back as the shirt was yanked downward. "Stop," Madden commanded. The word was like a gunshot. The guard froze, his grip still tight on my arm. Madden Taylor was standing now. The bored, lethal indifference had vanished from his face. He moved toward me, his step slow and predatory, his gaze fixed entirely on my throat. I tried to pull away to hide the skin that was now exposed to the moonlight, but I was pinned. He reached out, his tattooed hand trembling almost imperceptibly as he brushed my hair aside. His fingers were cold as ice against my skin. There, etched in dark, ancient lines on the side of my neck, was the twin to the mark on his hand. A lion, regal and defiant, the sigil of a dynasty that was supposed to have burned to ashes 10 years ago. Madden's face went white. The ruthless king of the city looked like he had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. "Lily Milan," he breathed, his voice cracking the mask of the mafia boss. I looked into his eyes, the neutral expression I had practiced for years finally shattering. The invisible girl was dead. The lioness had been found. The silence on the terrace was no longer empty. It was heavy, vibrating with a tension so thick it felt like it could shatter the crystal glasses on the tables. The guard's hand was still clamped onto my arm, but his fingers had gone slack, his confusion mirroring the shock of every other man in the room. They were waiting for a signal, a nod, or a blade, but Madden Taylor was no longer looking at them. He was looking at me as if the rest of the world had dissolved into gray ash. "Leave," Madden said. It wasn't a request. It was an edict that brooked no delay. The bearded man beside me hesitated, his eyes darting between his boss and the torn fabric of my shirt. "But boss, she's a liability," she saw. "Out," Madden roared, his voice echoing off the glass partitions of the rooftop. "Now, all of you, clear the floor." The movement was frantic. The guards, the waiters, even Elias, who looked like he was on the verge of a heart attack, scrambled toward the velvet curtains. Within seconds, the heavy thud of the double doors signaled that we were alone. The distant hum of the city traffic far below was the only sound left, a ghostly reminder of a world that no longer mattered. Madden didn't move. He stood less than a foot away, his breathing shallow and jagged. The white cuff of his shirt was still stained with the wine I'd spilled, but he seemed to have forgotten the insult entirely. His eyes remained anchored to the side of my neck, tracing the ink lines of the lion with an intensity that made me feel exposed, more naked than if I'd been wearing nothing at all. "Who gave this to you?" he demanded. His voice had returned to that low, dangerous drawl, but there was a tremor in it now, a crack in the granite. I pulled my shoulders back, trying to summon the ghost of the girl I used to be before the fire, before the blood, before the running. My heart was a drum in my ears, but I forced my gaze to meet his. I was tired of being the shadow. If I was going to die tonight, I would die with my name in my mouth. "It's a Milan mark," I said, my voice steady despite the chill of the night air. "You know exactly what it is, Madden. You carry the same ink." He flinched as if I'd struck him. He reached out again, his thumb grazing the very edge of the tattoo. I didn't pull away this time. I watched his face, watching the blood drain from his cheeks until he looked like a man carved from marble. "The Milans are dead," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "I saw the estate burn. I saw the records. There were no survivors. The syndicate ensured there was nothing left but smoke and bone." "Smoke can be inhaled," I countered, my eyes narrowing. "And bones can be hidden. I was in the cellar when the first grenades went off. My father threw me into the coal chute before the ceiling collapsed. I didn't just survive the fire, Madden. I became it." Madden's hand dropped from my neck, but he didn't step back. He began to pace the small area of the terrace, his movements restless and predatory. He looked like a king who had just discovered a hidden blade in his own throne room. Every few seconds his eyes would snap back to me, verifying that I hadn't vanished into the night air. "The Lion of Milan," he muttered, his jaw tightening. "If the others find out, if the council hears that a daughter of the old blood is still drawing breath in this city, they won't just remove you, Lily. They will tear this entire borough apart to find you." "I know," I said quietly. "That's why I've been a ghost. That's why I've been pouring your wine and scrubbing your floors for 3 months. I didn't want a crown. I just wanted to live." Madden stopped his pacing and turned to face me fully. The cold sea color of his eyes seemed to darken, shifting from shock to something much more complicated. It was a look of recognition, of a shared burden that went deeper than any mafia hierarchy. He looked at the lion on his own hand and then back at the one on my neck. "You were the girl in the portrait," he said, a sudden memory lighting up his face. "In your father's study. He used to tell me that the lioness was the true hunter of the pride. I was his protégé, Lily. He taught me how to lead, how to strike, how to survive. When the hit happened, I was in Chicago. By the time I got back, there was nothing left but ash. I thought I had failed him. I thought I had let his entire legacy burn." He stepped closer again, entering my personal space until I could feel the heat radiating from his suit. He was a man built of power and secrets, a man I should have feared above all others. But in that moment, seeing the way his hand still shook, the fear began to morph into something else. Something heavy and inevitable. "You're not a waitress," he said, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "And you're not a ghost. Not anymore. What are you going to do?" I asked. "Are you going to finish what the council started?" Madden reached out, his hand cupping my jaw with a possessiveness that sent a jolt of electricity through my spine. He leaned down, his lips inches from my ear, his breath warm against my skin. "I told them to remove you, Lily, but I didn't know who you were. Now that I do, I'm changing the order." He pulled back just enough to look me in the eye, his expression hardening into something fiercely protective. The shock was gone, replaced by a dark, shimmering resolve. "You aren't going anywhere. You're coming with me. From this moment on, you are under my shadow. And if anyone, council or otherwise, tries to touch a single hair on your head, I will burn this city to the ground to keep you safe. He didn't wait for my answer. He gripped my hand, his tattooed lion pressing against my skin, and began to lead me toward the exit. The invisible girl was gone, and as we stepped through the velvet curtains together, I knew that the silence of the night was about to be broken by the roar of the Pride. The car was a silent vault of leather and shadows, cutting through the city's neon-veined streets with a predatory smoothness. Madden sat beside me, his presence filling the cramped space until it felt like the oxygen was being filtered through his lungs before it reached mine. He hadn't let go of my hand. His tattooed fingers remained laced with mine, his thumb occasionally brushing over my knuckles in a rhythmic, grounding motion that contradicted the storm I saw in his eyes every time we passed under a street lamp. I watched the skyscrapers blur into the sprawling iron gates of an estate that looked more like a fortress than a home. When the engine finally died, the silence that rushed in was deafening. Madden led me inside, past stone-faced men who bowed their heads in a way that made my skin crawl. They didn't look at me as a waitress anymore. They looked at me as if I were a ghost they weren't quite sure how to mourn. He brought me into a high-ceilinged library that smelled of old paper, expensive tobacco, and a history I had spent a decade trying to burn from my memory. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass and handed it to me. His hand was finally steady, but the paleness of his face remained, a stark contrast to the dark ink on his skin. "How?" he asked, the word barely a whisper. "I stood on that charred earth, Lily. I saw the Milan crest cracked in half over the driveway. I was told no one got out." I took a sip of the drink, the burn in my throat matching the heat behind my eyes. I walked over to a floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the manicured gardens that were so different from the wild, overgrown hedges of my childhood. 10 years ago, the world ended in 20 minutes, I began, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Everyone thinks the massacre started at the front gates. They think my father had time to call for help. But the betrayal was inside the house. The cooks, the drivers, the people who had tucked me into bed. Half of them were on the council's payroll." I closed my eyes, and for a second I wasn't in a luxury estate. I was back in the cellar, the air thick with the smell of copper and smoke. My father knew. I continued. He saw the shift in the guard's eyes before the first shot was fired. He grabbed me by the waist and threw me into the coal chute. It was small, jagged, and filthy. He told me to crawl until I hit the drainage pipe and not to stop until I smelled the salt of the bay. I heard the door kick in above us. I heard him scream my mother's name. And then I heard the silence. Madden moved behind me, his shadow falling over mine against the glass. I could feel the heat of him, the silent fury radiating off his chest. "I spent 3 days in those pipes," I said, my voice cracking. "I crawled through the filth of the city I was supposed to rule. When I finally came out, I was covered in soot and blood that wasn't mine. I found a thrift store, stole a coat, and vanished. I realized very quickly that the only way to stay alive was to become the person the world ignored. I became a maid, a dishwasher, a laundress. I moved every 6 months. I changed my name 4 times. I turned around to face him, the moonlight catching the tears I refused to let fall. I learned to be invisible because being a Milan was a death sentence. That tattoo on my neck? I tried to have it removed 2 years in. The artist told me it was too deep, too close to the artery. He said if he tried to scrub it out, I'd bleed to death. So I covered it with high collars and scarves. I became a master of the mundane. Madden reached out, his hand hovering near the torn edge of my shirt where the lion peeked through. The look on his face wasn't pity. It was a terrifying, soul-deep recognition. "I spent those same 10 years hunting the people who did it," he said, his voice dropping to a jagged edge. I built the Taylor Syndicate on the bones of the men who betrayed your father. I thought I was avenging a dead line. I thought I was the last keeper of the Lion's Code. He stepped into my space, his hands coming up to rest on my shoulders. His grip was firm, a silent promise that the running was over. You've been hiding in plain sight, Lily. Pouring drinks for the very men who would have put a bullet in your head if they'd looked an inch to the left. But that ends tonight. You aren't a ghost anymore, and you aren't alone. What happens now? I asked, the weight of the last 10 years finally beginning to settle in my bones. The council will find out. They have eyes everywhere. Madden's jaw set, and for a moment, the man who had turned pale on the terrace was gone, replaced by the apex predator the city feared. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine, his eyes burning with a dark, possessive light. Let them find out, he growled. Let them come. They think the Milans are a memory, but they're about to realize that a lioness is never more dangerous than when she's been hunting in the shadows for 10 years. I've spent a decade building an empire, Lily. Now I finally have someone to share the throne with. He pulled me into him, and for the first time in a decade, the cold that had lived in my marrow began to thaw. I was Lily Milan. I was the last of my kind, and the man holding me was ready to set the world on fire just to hear me roar. The morning sun filtered through the tall, arched windows of the library, but the warmth didn't reach me. I was wrapped in a silk robe that felt like water against my skin, a stark contrast to the stiff polyester waitress uniform I'd worn only hours before. I stood by the fireplace watching the embers die out, feeling the weight of the silence in the room. I had been given a room, a bath, and a few hours of fitful sleep, but the sense of being trapped was more suffocating than the coal chute had ever been. The heavy mahogany doors creaked open, and Madden stepped in. He had changed his suit, but the intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. He didn't say good morning. He didn't ask how I felt. He simply walked to the center of the room and looked at me as if he were cataloging every part of my soul. We need to discuss the terms of your stay here, he said, his voice flat and professional, though his gaze lingered on the tattoo at my neck. Terms? I asked, a spark of the old Milan defiance flickering in my chest. I thought you were protecting me. I am, he replied, stepping closer. But you need to understand that you are no longer a private citizen, Lily. You are a walking powder keg. The moment I stopped my men from removing you, I signaled to the entire underground that you are something of value. If I let you walk out those gates right now, you wouldn't make it 2 blocks. The council has ears in every corner of this city. They would have you in a cellar within the hour, peeling that skin off your neck to see if it's real. I felt a chill wash over me. The reality of my situation was sinking in. I had traded a life of quiet fear for a life of gilded imprisonment. So what am I? A prisoner? I challenged, folding my arms. You are a guest, he said, his jaw tightening. But you are a guest who cannot leave. My men will be at your door. They will be at your side if you move through the house. You will not use the phone, and you will not contact anyone from your previous life. Your life as a waitress is over. That girl is dead. And what about the girl who is still here? I asked. The one you claim to be protecting? Madden's expression softened for a fraction of a second, his eyes searching mine. You are the daughter of the man who made me. I will keep you alive because I owe him that. But don't mistake my protection for a lack of control. In this house, my word is law. You are claimed, Lily. To the world, you belong to the Taylor Syndicate now. It's the only thing keeping the wolves at bay. He moved toward me, his presence overwhelming. He reached out, his fingers tracing the silk of my sleeve. His touch was light, but the possessiveness behind it was unmistakable. He wasn't just saving a legacy. He was claiming a prize. He looked at me not as a person, but as a piece of history he had finally recovered. "I'm not a piece of property, Madden," I whispered, my voice trembling. "No," he agreed, his eyes darkening. "You're much more dangerous than that. You're a catalyst. And until I know exactly how to use you, you stay where I can see you." He turned to leave, his coat billowing behind him. At the door he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Elias sent over your belongings from the locker at the restaurant," he said. "I had them burned. You won't be needing them where we're going." I watched him go, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. He hadn't saved me from a life of fear. He had simply replaced one cage with another. I was no longer a shadow in the city, but I was far from free. I was the last Milan, and I was exactly where the most dangerous man in New York wanted me. I walked back to the window, watching the guards patrol the perimeter. I was claimed, but I wasn't saved. And as I looked at the lion tattoo reflected in the glass, I knew that if I wanted my life back, I would have to learn how to hunt in this new glittering jungle. The confinement of the estate began to feel less like a prison and more like a museum dedicated to a life I had tried to forget. As the days bled into one another, the heavy silence of the hallways became a weight I had to carry. I found myself wandering into the East Wing, a part of the house that felt colder, more preserved. The guards followed at a distance, their footsteps a constant, muffled reminder that my freedom was a ghost. But they didn't stop me when I pushed open the double doors to Madden's private study. The room smelled of cedar and old ink. It was a masculine sanctuary, filled with leather-bound books and heavy bronze sculptures. I walked toward the massive oak desk, my eyes scanning the surface until they landed on a framed photograph tucked partially behind a stack of ledgers. My breath hitched. It was a grainy, candid shot of my father. He was younger, laughing, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who couldn't have been older than 18. The boy was Madden. A shadow crossed the doorway, and I didn't need to turn to know who it was. The air always seemed to tighten when he entered a room. "He didn't want anyone to see that," Madden said, his voice quiet, lacking the sharp edge of command he usually wielded. "He was a hard man, Lily. He was the Lion of Milan for a reason. But he took me in when I was nothing but a street rat with a quick hand and a temper." I traced the glass over my father's face. "Why?" I asked. "Why would a man like him risk his empire for a nobody like you?" Madden walked over, standing close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his suit. He set his hand on the desk, the light catching the dark ink on the back of his knuckles. He looked at the lion tattooed there, his gaze distant. "Because he saw a hunger in me that he recognized," Madden replied. "He didn't just teach me how to run a syndicate. He taught me about loyalty. He taught me that a leader is only as strong as the people he protects. When he gave me this mark, it wasn't a brand. It was an adoption." I looked from the photograph to Madden's hand, then up at his face. The ruthless mafia boss I had seen on the terrace was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was still mourning a father he hadn't been related to by blood. "He told me that if anything ever happened to the Pride, I was to find the cubs," Madden continued, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "I spent years thinking I was the only one left to carry the name. Every time I look at this hand, I feel the weight of his death. I didn't get this tattoo to show off my rank, Lily. I got it so I would never forget the man who gave me a life worth living." A strange, painful knot tightened in my chest. For 10 years I had viewed the Milan name as a curse, a mark of death that had followed me into the shadows. But seeing it through Madden's eyes, seeing it as a symbol of a mentorship that had shaped the most powerful man in the city, changed the perspective. "He loved you," I whispered, realizing it for the first time. "He looked at you like a son." Madden's jaw tightened and he looked away, his eyes fixed on the distant skyline visible through the window. He didn't answer, but the way his fingers curled into a fist spoke volumes. He wasn't just protecting me out of some abstract sense of duty or a desire to claim a prize. He was protecting the only piece of his true father he had left. The realization made the silk of my robe feel heavier. I wasn't just a guest or a prisoner. I was the living embodiment of the legacy he had sworn to uphold. Madden turned back to me, his expression hardening as he reclaimed his mask of indifference, but the vulnerability remained in the depths of his winter-sea eyes. "That is why you stay here," he said, his voice regaining its steel. "Not because you are a liability, and not because I want to own you. You stay because as long as you are in this house, the Milan line hasn't been extinguished. And as long as I am breathing, I will not let them kill him a second time by taking you." He reached out, his thumb grazing the tattoo on my neck. The touch was different now. Not a claim of ownership, but a silent vow of kinship. I looked at the man who had been a stranger to me a week ago, and realized that our fates had been stitched together long before we ever met at a restaurant table. We were both marked by the same lion, and we were both haunted by the same fire. I finally understood that the king's mercy wasn't about letting me live. It was about his refusal to let the only family he ever knew disappear. As he pulled his hand away and walked toward the door, I didn't feel like a prisoner anymore. I felt like a soldier being recruited into a war I thought I had lost. The fragile peace of the estate shattered at 3 in the morning. I was jolted from a restless sleep not by a sound, but by the sudden haunting absence of it. The constant hum of the centralized air conditioning had cut out, and the secondary perimeter lights that usually bled through the gaps in my heavy curtains had vanished, plunging the room into a thick, suffocating ink. I sat up, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. In the 10 years I had spent running, I had learned that silence was rarely a gift. It was usually the indrawn breath before a scream. A heavy thud echoed from the hallway, followed by the muffled metallic pop of a suppressed firearm. My blood turned to ice. They were here. I didn't know how they had found me, or which of Madden's men had whispered the secret of the waitress with the lion on her neck, but the ghosts of my past had finally breached the walls of my sanctuary. I slid out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold marble floor. I didn't reach for a robe or a light. I reached for the heavy brass fire poker by the hearth, my fingers curling around the cold metal with an instinct I thought I had buried in the coal chute a decade ago. The bedroom door burst open. A man framed in the dim moonlight of the hallway stepped inside, a tactical vest over his dark clothes and a mask obscuring his face. He didn't look like one of Madden's guards. He moved with the jagged, hungry energy of the Venezzi family, the butchers who had led the charge against the Milans all those years ago. He raised his weapon, the barrel finding the shape of my body in the dark, but he never got the chance to pull the trigger. A shadow surged from the darkness of the corridor behind him. Madden. He didn't use a gun. He moved like a whirlwind of controlled violence, his tattooed hand snapping the man's wrist back with a sickening crunch before driving a serrated blade into the soft tissue beneath the intruder's chin. The man collapsed without a sound. Madden stepped over the body and into my room, his chest heaving, his white shirt splattered with fresh crimson. He looked like the devil himself, but when his eyes found mine, the predatory fire softened into something desperate. "Lily," he breathed, reaching out to grab my shoulder. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," I whispered, my voice sounding distant even to me. "How did they get past the gates?" "Betrayal," he spat, the word dripping with venom. "The Venetzes didn't just want you dead. They wanted to humiliate me by taking you from under my roof. They've been waiting for a Milan to surface for 10 years. They think you're the key to the old family vaults." Another explosion rocked the house, the vibration rattling the floorboards. The smell of smoke began to drift through the vents, acrid and familiar. It was the smell of my childhood burning. It was the smell of the end. "We have to go," Madden said, his grip tightening. "My men are holding the grand staircase, but they've breached the service tunnels. This wasn't a hit, Lily. This is a siege." He pulled a compact handgun from his waistband and pressed it into my hand. The weight was cold and final. "Do you remember how to use this?" he asked. I looked at the lion on the back of his hand, then at the gun. "My father made sure I knew how to defend the pride before I could read a map," I replied, my voice hardening. Madden gave a grim nod, a flash of dark pride crossing his features. "Good. Stay behind me. We're going to the garage. If anyone steps in our way who isn't wearing a Taylor crest, you don't hesitate. You don't think. You just fire." We moved through the house like ghosts. The hallways were a chaotic blur of strobe lights from flickering security panels and the shadows of men engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Madden fought with a savagery that was terrifying to witness, clearing a path through the Venezia scouts with a cold efficiency that left no room for mercy. As we reached the heavy steel doors of the underground garage, a voice boomed through the speakers of the intercom system, distorted and mocking. "Give us the girl, Taylor. You're protecting a corpse. The Milans belong to the earth, and you're going to join them." Madden stopped, his hand on the keypad. He looked back at me, the moonlight from a high clear-story window illuminating the jagged scar on his jaw and the fierce, unyielding light in his eyes. He didn't look pale anymore. He looked like a man who had finally found something worth burning the world for. "They think you're a ghost, Lily," he said, his voice a low vibrating growl. "They think you're a weakness I'm trying to hide." I stepped up beside him, the handgun heavy in my grip, the lion on my neck exposed and defiant in the shadows. "Let them think that," I said. "It'll make it easier to catch them by surprise when the ghost starts hitting back." Madden's lips pulled back into a dark, lethal smile. He punched in the final code, and the heavy doors groaned open. The rival gang was waiting in the driveway, their headlights cutting through the smoke like the eyes of hungry wolves. But as we stepped into the light together, I realized that for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't the one being hunted. With Madden Taylor at my side, the lioness was finally ready to go on the prowl. The garage was a cavern of concrete and cold echoes, illuminated by the rhythmic pulse of emergency strobes. Madden's fleet of black SUVs stood like sleeping beasts, but the men waiting in the driveway were very much awake. Muzzle flashes lit up the dark, the sharp cracks of gunfire bouncing off the low ceiling. Madden shoved me behind the rear fender of a reinforced sedan, his body a shield as he returned fire with a precision that was chilling to watch. A heavy caliber round shattered the window of the car above my head, raining tempered glass onto my hair. The fear that had paralyzed me for 10 years didn't vanish, but it shifted. It stopped being a suffocating weight and became a sharp, cold clarity. The scent of gunpowder and the vibration of the concrete under my palms triggered a memory I had locked away in a box of nightmares. "Lily, stay down," Madden shouted over the roar of an engine. I didn't listen. My eyes were fixed on a shadow moving through the darkness toward our left flank. It was a Venezia soldier, flanking us through the utility pipes. He was fast, moving with a blade in his hand, clearly intending to take me alive while Madden was occupied with the main line. Before the man could reach the corner of the sedan, I moved. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was muscle memory carved into my bones by a father who knew his daughter would one day be a target. I dropped low, sweeping the fire poker I still held across the man's shins. As he stumbled, I didn't hesitate. I rose in one fluid motion, driving my elbow into the hinge of his jaw just as I'd been taught in the training halls of the Milan estate. The man groaned, his weapon clattering to the floor. I didn't stop. I stepped into his personal space, caught his wrist, and twisted until the bone gave a sharp, sickening pop. I wasn't the waitress from the rooftop lounge anymore. I wasn't the girl who apologized for spilling wine. I was a Milan, and the blood in my veins was screaming for survival. Madden spun around, his gun raised to clear the threat, but he stopped when he saw the soldier slumped unconscious at my feet. The look he gave me was one of pure, unadulterated shock. He had seen the tattoo, he knew the name, but he hadn't expected the skill. The Milan training, he muttered. A grim realization dawning on him. It's not something you forget, I said, my voice sounding like steel. 2 more men burst through the side door, their flashlights cutting through the smoke. Madden didn't have time to react as his slide locked back on an empty magazine. I didn't wait for him to reload. I raised the handgun he'd given me, my grip firm and two-handed. The front sight aligned perfectly with the center mass of the first intruder. I squeezed the trigger. The recoil was a familiar kick against my palms. The first man went down. I shifted my aim to the second, my breathing shallow and controlled, my vision tunneling until there was nothing but the target. I fired again. The silence that followed was heavy with the smell of sulfur. Madden slammed a fresh magazine into his weapon, his gaze lingering on me for a second longer than was safe. There was something new in his eyes, not just the possessiveness of a protector, but the respect of an equal. He saw the lioness he had promised to protect was more than capable of biting back. We have to move now, he barked, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the lead SUV. As we scrambled into the armored vehicle and he floored the accelerator, the gates hissed open to reveal a city that felt smaller than it had yesterday. The Venetzes had tried to finish the job they started a decade ago, but they had made a fatal mistake. They thought they were hunting a lamb. I sat in the passenger seat, the gun resting on my lap, my hands finally starting to shake as the adrenaline began its slow, painful ebb. I looked at Madden, his face a mask of focus as he swerved through the narrow alleyways to lose our pursuers. You're staring, he said, his voice a low vibration in the small cabin. I didn't know you were that good, I replied. Madden glanced at me, a dark, fleeting smile touching his lips. And I didn't know the last Milan was a marksman. He reached over, his tattooed hand covering mine on the cold metal of the gun. The touch was grounding, a silent acknowledgement that the invisible life I'd built was gone forever. I had reawakened the instincts I'd spent a decade trying to kill. And as the city lights blurred past us, I knew there was no going back to the shadows. The war had found me, and for the first time in 10 years I was ready to fight it. The safe house was a cabin tucked deep into the dense woods of upstate New York, a place where the air tasted of pine and wet earth rather than exhaust and ozone. Madden had stayed awake the entire drive, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror with a relentless predatory focus. When we finally arrived, he didn't just usher me inside. He swept the perimeter himself, his weapon drawn, his shadow stretching long and dark against the porch light. Inside, the cabin was rustic but stocked with the same cold precision as his city estate. I sat at the small wooden kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. The adrenaline had finally left me, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest and a trembling I couldn't suppress. I was no longer the invisible waitress, but I wasn't quite the Milan princess either. I was something caught in between, a ghost struggling to reclaim its skin. Madden entered the kitchen, his leather jacket squeaking as he shrugged it off. He had cleaned the blood from his face, but a dark bruise was blooming along his ribs where a stray kick had landed. He looked at me, and for the first time the calculation in his gaze was gone. It had been replaced by something raw, something that looked dangerously like fear. You shouldn't have had to do that, he said, his voice a low, rough vibration. You were supposed to be safe. I told you I would protect you. I looked up at him, the steam from the cold tea ghosting against my chin. You did protect me, Madden. But you can't fight my past for me. It's written on my neck. It's in my blood. He walked toward me, his steps heavy on the floorboards. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of me, his shadow swallowing me whole. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face before finally settling against my cheek. His thumb traced the line of my jaw, his touch unexpectedly tender. I spent 10 years thinking of the Milans as a concept, he whispered, his eyes searching mine with a desperate intensity. A legacy. A debt. But watching you in that garage, seeing you move like a shadow, seeing you fight for your life, he trailed off, his jaw tightening. I realized then that Madden Taylor, the man who had built an empire on iron and blood, was unraveling. The professional distance he had tried to maintain, the idea of me as a lost asset, had shattered during the siege. I'm not just a duty to you anymore, am I? I asked, my voice barely a breath. No, he growled, his hand sliding into my hair to pull me closer. You're a nightmare, Lily. You're the only thing in this world that makes me feel like I have something to lose. I was supposed to respect you. I was supposed to honor your father's memory. I wasn't supposed to want to keep you for myself. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine. The possessiveness in his voice wasn't like my ex-boyfriend's escalating control. It wasn't a desire to diminish me. It was an acknowledgement that I was the center of his gravity. I felt the heat of him, the sheer power of his presence, and I realized I was falling too. I was falling for the man who had seen the real me and didn't turn away. Madden stepped back, but only far enough to reach for the serrated blade he kept in his waistband. I stiffened, my breath catching, but he didn't point the steel at me. Instead, he took the blade and pressed the edge against the palm of his own hand, the one marked with the lion. With a swift, practiced motion, he drew the steel across his skin. A thin line of crimson welled up, bright and stark against the dark ink. Madden? I gasped. He didn't answer. He took my hand, the one I had used to fire the gun in the garage, and held it firmly. His eyes were fixed on mine, burning with a light that was both holy and terrifying. In our world, words are cheap, he said, his voice dropping to a jagged, formal tone. The Milans and the Taylors were bound by paper and promises. But tonight that ends. I'm not protecting you because of your father. I'm protecting you because you are mine. He pressed his bleeding palm against mine, our skin meeting in a warm, slick contact. The blood of the protector mingled with the blood of the survivor. I, Madden Taylor, swear this oath to the last Milan, he intoned, the words echoing in the small kitchen. My life for yours. My blood for yours. Your enemies are my prey. Your safety is my only law. If I fail you, may the earth swallow the Taylor name and leave nothing but salt. The weight of the oath settled over us, a physical thing that seemed to hum in the air. This wasn't a deal or a contract. It was a blood bond. He was binding his soul to a girl who was supposed to be dead, knowing it meant eternal war with the council. I looked down at our joined hands, the red staining both our wrists. I felt the power of his claim, and for the first time in 10 years, the fear didn't just move, it evaporated. I wasn't just under his shadow. I was part of it. I believe you, I said, my voice finally finding its strength. Madden pulled me into him then, his kiss tasting of salt and copper and a dark, desperate love. He had claimed the lioness, and as we stood in the silence of the woods, I knew the world would have to burn before he ever let go. The sanctuary of the cabin felt increasingly like a glass house, while the blood oath had forged a bond between Madden and me that felt unbreakable. The world outside was still jagged and hungry. Madden spent his days on encrypted lines, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards as he moved pieces across the city's chessboard to shield me. He was distracted, his focus pulled toward the looming war with the Venetsis, and in that distraction, a shadow found its way inside. It happened on the fifth evening. Madden had stepped out to a nearby clearing to meet a courier, leaving me under the watch of Silas, a veteran soldier who had been with the Taylor Syndicate since before Madden took the throne. Silas was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of scars that spoke of a lifetime of service. I had trusted him because Madden trusted him, but as I sat by the window watching the sun dip below the pines, I noticed a change in his posture. He wasn't watching the perimeter. He was watching me, his hand hovering nervously near his pocket. "Is something wrong, Silas?" I asked, the old hypervigilance from my years as a waitress flaring up. He didn't answer immediately. He checked his watch, then his phone, the blue light reflecting in his cold, sunken eyes. "The Venetsis are offering 10 million for the head of the last Milan," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. 10 million. Do you know how much blood a man has to spill to earn that kind of retirement, Lily? My heart didn't race, it went still. I stood up slowly, keeping the kitchen table between us. "Madden will kill you before you even see a dime of that money." "Madden is blinded by a ghost story," Silas spat, finally pulling a burner phone from his pocket. "He thinks he's saving a legacy. I think he's leading us all into a meat grinder for a girl who should have stayed in the ash. The Venetsis are 5 minutes out. They've bypassed the perimeter sensors because I gave them the codes." He raised his weapon, but his hand wasn't steady. It wasn't the hesitation of a good man. It was the greed of an old one. He didn't want to kill me, not yet. He needed me alive for the handoff. The betrayal cut deeper than the Venetzi's bullets ever could. This was the rot within the pride, the same kind of internal poison that had destroyed my father. I looked at the lion on the side of my neck in the reflection of the window and felt a cold, sharp rage settle over me. I wasn't just a girl to be traded. "You think you're the first person to try and sell me?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think I survived 10 years of hiding because I was lucky?" Before Silas could respond, I lunged. I didn't go for his gun. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with every ounce of strength I had cultivated while lifting trays and moving furniture in the dark. The metal connected with his forearm with a sickening crunch, sending his weapon skittering across the floorboards. He roared in pain, lunging for me with his good arm, but I was faster. I was smaller, more agile, and fueled by the realization that if I didn't end this now, Madden would walk into an ambush when he returned. I used his own momentum against him, grabbing his collar and slamming him face first into the edge of the heavy oak table. He slumped to the floor, dazed but not out. I scrambled for the gun, my fingers brushing the cold steel just as the front door was kicked open. I thought it was the Venetsis. I thought the 5 minutes were up. I leveled the barrel at the doorway, my finger tightening on the trigger, ready to die to keep my secret safe. But it was Madden. He took in the scene in a heartbeat, Silas bleeding on the floor, the burner phone humming on the table, and me standing over the wreckage with a weapon in my hand and fire in my eyes. He didn't look shocked this time. He looked devastated. The betrayal of his oldest lieutenant was a blow to his heart, but his first move was toward me. "Did he touch you?" Madden growled, his voice a terrifying sound that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. "He sold us out, Madden," I panted, the gun still gripped in my hands. "The Venetsis are coming. Now." Madden didn't waste a second. He walked over to Silas, who was groaning on the floor, and looked down at him with a coldness that made the winter outside seem warm. He didn't ask for explanations. He didn't offer a trial. He simply reached down, took the burner phone, and crushed it under the heel of his boot. You were like a father to me, Silas, Madden said. His voice a jagged, low frequency of pure grief. But you threatened the only thing that makes me a man. He didn't look away as he ended the betrayal with a single silent motion of his blade. He then turned to me, his white shirt once again ruined by the blood of the men he had trusted. He took the gun from my shaking hands and pulled me into his chest, his heart beating a frantic rhythmic war drum against my ear. The sanctuary is gone, he whispered into my hair. They're coming for the lioness, Lily. And this time we aren't going to hide. We're going to meet them at the gates. I pulled back to look at him, seeing the king he had become and the protector he had sworn to be. The betrayal had stripped away the last of our illusions. We were alone against the world. Two marked lions in a forest full of wolves. Let them come, I said, reaching up to touch the lion on his hand. I'm tired of running. The safe house was no longer a retreat. It was a war room. The scent of spilled blood and spent brass still hung in the air from Silas's betrayal. But the grief that had initially clouded Madden's eyes had hardened into a cold, diamond-sharp resolve. He sat at the wooden table, cleaning the slide of his weapon with a steady hand, while I stood by the window, watching the first light of dawn bleed across the horizon. I wasn't the girl who had fled Boston with a single suitcase and a heart full of shadows. I was the girl who had taken down a traitor with a cast-iron skillet and held a gun without flinching. It's time, Madden said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to pull the very air from the room. The Venetzes think they're coming for a scattered pride. They don't realize we've already moved the pieces. He stood up, walking over to me. He didn't offer a platitude about safety or stay behind. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a second magazine, sliding it across the table toward me. He was finally seeing me as the partner the Milan name demanded I be. They're gathered at the old distillery on the waterfront, he continued, his tattooed hand coming up to rest on my shoulder. The entire council is there to witness the handoff. They think Silas is bringing you in chains. Then let's give them the show they paid for, I replied, my voice devoid of the tremors that had defined my life for a decade. The drive back toward the city was different from the escape. There was no running, only the relentless forward momentum of two predators closing in on their prey. We reached the distillery an hour before sunrise, the skeleton of the industrial building looming over the black water of the harbor like a tombstone. We moved in silence, a coordinated dance of shadows. Madden took the high ground, his silhouette blending into the rusted iron rafters, while I moved through the ground floor, hidden by the crates and the heavy, humid fog. I could hear them, the Venezzi brothers, laughing as they toasted to the end of the Milan line. They sounded arrogant, drunk on the belief that history was theirs to rewrite. Now Madden's voice crackled through the small earpiece I wore. The first explosion wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to blind. The flashbangs transformed the dark distillery into a white-hot chaos. I moved through the smoke like a ghost reclaiming its haunting grounds. I didn't feel the fear of the coal chute or the desperation of the restaurant floor. I felt the weight of my father's legacy and the strength of the man waiting in the rafters. I stepped into the light of the main floor just as the Venezzi elders scrambled for their weapons. Their eyes widened, their gazes locking onto the lion tattoo on my neck, the mark they thought they had buried in the ash 10 years ago. The last Milan, one of them wheezed, his hand shaking as he raised a pistol. I didn't give him the chance to speak again. I fired with the cold precision Madden had admired in the garage. Beside me, Madden descended from the catwalk, his movements a blur of lethal grace as he cleared the remaining guards. He fought not like a man defending a prize, but like a king reclaiming a throne. When the last of the Venezia men lay silent on the cold concrete, Madden walked toward me, his breathing heavy, his face smudged with soot and blood. He stopped a foot away, the light of the rising sun catching the dark ink on his hand and the twin mark on my neck. He didn't pull me into a protective embrace this time. He stood beside me, his shoulder brushing mine, as we looked out at the city skyline beginning to glow with the promise of a new day. "The council is dead," he said, his voice a jagged, triumphant growl. "The debt is paid, Lily." "It's not just about the debt anymore, Madden," I said, reaching out to lace my fingers with his. The blood on our hands was the same. The lion on our skin was the same. He turned to me then, the possessiveness in his eyes now tempered with a profound, soul-deep respect. He leaned down, his forehead resting against mine, our breaths mingling in the cool morning air. "Then let them hear us roar," he whispered. In the heart of the city that had tried to erase me, the silence was finally broken. The waitress was gone, and the invisible girl had vanished into the smoke. In her place stood a queen, flanked by the only man brave enough to claim her. As we walked out of the distillery and into the light, I knew the era of the shadows was over. A new era of rule had begun, and the world was finally going to learn what happens when you try to kill a lioness and leave her with nothing but her name and a king who would burn the world to keep it.